We began our readings today with a reading from the book of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah had a very difficult challenge given to him by God. He lived at a time when he had to speak out against things, and because of that, he had much opposition coming back at him. And he really found that hard. He was a very simple, delicate man, and so he found it hard to carry out the mission. And that's what we hear in the reading today, the section from chapter 20 of Jeremiah. And he basically is saying, I didn't want this, Lord. You know that. You duped me. You gave me this mission, and I didn't want it, and I still don't want it. I don't like all the opposition I'm getting. Why did you choose me? Basically, that's what he's saying. And that ties in, I think, with the gospel reading, in that Jesus is getting to the point in his ministry where he has to speak a hard truth to his closest associates, and they don't want to hear it, especially Peter. So there's a combination or a connection between the reading, as there often is, between the first reading and the gospel. Jeremiah was an interesting man because he was a person of some delicacy, I guess we could say. He was not a man who enjoyed doing what God had asked him to do. And that can happen to any of us, can't it? And there's times in our lives when maybe we just don't want to do what we seem to have to do, but it's necessary. And so we can identify a bit with Jeremiah and other prophetic voices. You know, we say that when we're baptized, we become priest, prophet, and king. Well, the priest part isn't too bad, and the king part isn't too bad, but the prophet part isn't so happy most of the time. There were some prophets that spoke good words, consolation. But as Jeremiah says, I really didn't want to do this, Lord, and you know I struggle with it. So Jesus then in the gospel today has to begin telling his closest associates that he is going to have to suffer and die. And this is far from their view of what a Messiah should be. So it says, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer greatly from the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. This is the first prediction of the passion of Christ. There will be others. He will reiterate this because he knows it really doesn't sink in easily. You know, most of us, if we had our choice, would want a Messiah who never suffered, wouldn't we? We don't like the idea of having someone having to suffer, and yet that was part of who Jesus was for us and for our salvation. He came down from heaven, and he suffered on the cross for us. So Peter speaks up, as he often does, and he is very honest about the way he's feeling. He doesn't keep his feelings to himself, and he says, took Jesus aside and began to that no such thing should ever happen to you. In other words, how could you say that? How can you say that you're going to suffer and die? You're the chosen one of God. We know that. We believe in you now. And now you're telling us that the authorities in Jerusalem are going to put you to death? And he spoke so forcefully that Jesus had to, in turn, rebuke him. Peter rebuked Jesus for even mentioning those things. And then Jesus had to rebuke Peter. Get behind me, Satan. Of course, Jesus had just given him the name Peter. You are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church. We heard that last week. This comes this part of the gospel comes right after that. So it's like going from light to darkness, from joy to sorrow. Get behind me, Satan. Satan, in the sense, the adversary, that's what the word means, the one who tempts, gets him off his path. So basically, what Jesus is saying, you're making it hard for me, Peter. It's hard enough to have to face suffering and death without my closest associates turning on me and say, no, 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 no. Get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle to me. You are thinking, Jesus says, not the way God does, but as human beings do. So it's understandable. Peter was very much a human being, and he was thinking the way we do. We want to avoid suffering and death, certainly. And yet, this was not what God was calling Jesus to be and to do. We know that there was passages from the prophet Isaiah which are called the servant songs, the songs of the suffering servant. And there it was predicted very clearly that God's servant, the one who he chose to be his emissary, would suffer. And so Jesus is beginning to share with his closest disciples this situation. And then he said to them and to us, and this is probably the lesson that we have to take with us from Jesus. They're part we don't want to think about too much, but it's there as part of the gospel message. Whoever wishes to come after me, and literally a disciple is someone who follows a teacher, a master. So whoever wishes to be my disciple must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So we're going to pause now and just think about that. What must a disciple be ready to do? Deny himself. Say no to that self which raises itself up as the arbiter of things. We never stop being ourselves, but there's a false self which does not please God. A self that is determined to go its own way, to follow its own instincts. And this is what Peter is doing. And Jesus is saying, no, no. Anyone who wishes to be my disciple, that's all of us, dear friends. Anybody who wants to be a disciple of Jesus must first of all deny himself, the false self, the self which is not made in the image and likeness of God, and then take up his cross and follow me. Who is the first person in the gospel who takes up the cross of Jesus? Anybody have an idea? Right. I'm thinking of Simon of Cyrene, who literally was forced to take up the cross. Remember the story? As Jesus was going to his death on the cross, he was carrying the cross. Now, I don't want to get off the track here, but most scholars would say, no, it wasn't the cross as we know it. It was the cross beam. The Romans had, in their places of execution, they were very efficient. The Romans were good at being very efficient, even at putting people to death. So they had already had the poles there ready. The only thing that was carried was the cross beam that would go on top of the pole. And so that's Jesus carrying that cross beam to his execution. And we are then encouraged to follow Simon of Cyrene. What happened? He was coming in from the countryside. let's look at him again. Simon, another Simon. Simon, and this one from Cyrene. That's northern Africa. So his ancestry, either he came there directly or his ancestry was there. There was a Roman colony in northern Africa. We don't know for sure what his ethnic background would have been, whether he was dark-skinned or not, but one way or the other, they picked him out. He must have been a strong, husky-looking man. Well, there's a good man. So he was minding his own business. He was there as a pilgrim, and all of a sudden, the Roman soldiers say, you know, they come. And you obeyed when a Roman soldier said, you come. And so they forced him to help Jesus. They forced him. He didn't volunteer to carry the cross behind Jesus. So he was following Jesus. He was a disciple in that sense, carrying Jesus' cross for him, with him. Dear friends, he's the model for us, isn't he? We don't think of him as a great model, but he's the first to have been actually forced at first to carry the cross. And that must have made a huge impression on him. Couldn't help but learn who Jesus really was. Mark's gospel tells us the names of his two sons who were part of the Christian community in Rome. Perhaps then they became disciples of Jesus because of their father who had carried the cross behind our Lord. But be that as it may, he certainly became very close to Jesus. He saw him and must have been attracted to the witness he gave, having never known him before, but having been forced into that. So he's an example to us then of someone who denies himself. He was going about his own business. He had his own ideas that day. Maybe he was going to prepare for the Passover meal, whatever. He was just an innocent person who happened to be at the right place at the wrong time, or however you want to express it. So you can think about times in your life maybe where those kind of things happened to you. You didn't choose it, but it happened and you learned from it. He learned a great lesson. He learned to follow Jesus. Whoever wishes to be my disciple, to come after me, must deny himself. So he had to give up his own intentions, didn't he? Whatever plans he had for that day, he was forced to follow Jesus. But by the end of the journey, certainly, he became a true disciple. So much so that he shared the faith then with his two sons, Alexander and Rufus, who became well-known people in the Roman Church. Then Jesus goes on to talk about the fact that whoever wishes to save his life, to preserve it, will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. The great lesson then that when we give ourselves over to Jesus and become his true disciples, we really grab hold of the real self, who we are. Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, must be willing to lose his life for my sake. So it's a beautiful example then of someone who literally did what Jesus said a disciple must do, and so gives us a beautiful example of denying oneself, taking up the cross, and following Jesus.